Merry Christmas, or rather, a statistically average December 25th, which may or may not be of relevance to your time zone or belief system. Regardless, we proceed. Today's video has one small, insignificant Christmas detail, hidden somewhere in the middle. You probably won't notice it, or care, but it's there. This may be the most boring video ever made. I say maybe, because I haven't conducted a comprehensive survey of all videos ever created since the inception of moving pictures in 1888, which would be methodologically impossible and, frankly, pointless. But if you've clicked on this video, you're already demonstrating a concerning level of commitment to tedium. Have you ever wondered how nothing became something but then went back to being nothing? Of course you haven't. No reasonable person would. Yet here we are, about to spend the next 2 hours exploring exactly that phenomenon through the lens of a 17th century orphanage Christmas morning. By the end of this video, you will know things you never needed to know about the sleeping arrangements of institutionalized children in 1680s England. You will understand the precise thread count of their blankets. You will learn the names of wardens whose names were never worth remembering, and you will wonder why you're still here. But first, let me tell you about our sponsor. Wait, we don't have one, because who would sponsor this? Instead, after I present today's riveting tale of orphaned Christmas morning lethargy, I'll be offering you something equally unnecessary. A boring Christmas calendar featuring our friend Sleepsy Noel. 31 days of mild expressions that perfectly capture the essence of seasonal indifference. But more on that later. Much later. In exactly 1 hour, 47 minutes and 23 seconds. Now shall we begin this journey into the profound meaninglessness of December 25th, 1687. To properly understand what it was like to wake up on Christmas morning in a 17th century orphanage, we must first establish the historical context that nobody asked for. The year was 1687, which followed 1686 and preceded 1688, a fact that remains mathematically consistent regardless of your personal feelings about chronology. The specific orphanage in question was St. Bartholomew's Home for Foundling Children, established in 1673 by Sir Edmund Dulsworth III, whose grandfather was Edmund Dulsworth I, and whose father was, predictably, Edmund Dulsworth II. This naming convention suggests a family with limited imagination, which proved relevant to their approach to orphan care. Sir Edmund Dulsworth III was born on March 12, 1629, at approximately 3:47 in the afternoon, during what his mother described as an unremarkable labor. He weighed 7 pounds and 3 ounces, had all 10 fingers and all 10 toes, and cried for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds after birth, facts meticulously recorded by the family physician, Dr. Algernon Tedious, whose own birth weight was, coincidentally, also 7 pounds and 3 ounces. But I'm getting ahead of myself, or behind myself. Time is relative when discussing the profoundly mundane. The orphanage housed 47 children on the morning in question, though this number fluctuated based on factors including but not limited to death by consumption, adoption by reluctant relatives, apprenticeship to trades that no longer exist, and the occasional escape attempt that typically resulted in the child being returned within 48 hours after discovering that life outside the orphanage was marginally worse than life inside it. The children's names, in alphabetical order by first name, were as follows: Agnes Wobblefoot, Albert Sniffles, Bartholomew Dampnose, Beatrice Cuffsallet, Cecil Thinbones, Charlotte Palehands, Cornelius Weakknees, Dorothy Smallvoice, Edmund Sadcheeks, Eleanor Dulstare, Frederick Sloucher, Gertrude Mumbleton, Harold Snores, Henrietta Droopylid, Isaac Weezerkest, Jane Blank Expression, Jonathan Slowblink, Catherine Heavysigh, Lawrence Yawnmouth, Margaret Sleepy Eyes, Nathaniel Dozechin, Olivia Nodneck, Patrick Dreamstare, Penelope Restlessleep, Quincy Halfawake, Rachel Softsnore, Samuel Nightmumble, Sarah Pillowhair, Thomas Bedwrinkle, Ursula Blanket Clutch, Victoria Drowsyface, Walter Sleepwalk, and Wilhelmina Dozalot. These names, I should clarify, were not their birth names. They were assigned by the orphanage's head warden, Mrs. Prudence Describington, who believed that names should reflect a person's most obvious characteristic. This system, while practical for identification purposes, did little to boost the children's self-esteem. Mrs. Prudence Describington was herself a woman of unremarkable appearance, standing exactly 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with brown hair that she described as adequately brown, and eyes that she referred to as functionally grey. She had been widowed at the age of 34, when her husband, Mr. Reginald Describington, died in what can only be described as the most boring accident in recorded history. He fell asleep while standing and toppled over, hitting his head on a moderately sized rock. The orphanage building itself was constructed of grey stone, which had been chosen not for aesthetic reasons but because it was the cheapest stone available. The architect, a man named Geoffrey Unimaginative, had designed the building with a stunning commitment to functionality over beauty. It contained exactly 23 rooms, 12 dormitories, 1 dining hall, 1 kitchen, 1 office, 1 storage room, 1 laundry room, 1 infirmary, 1 chapel, 3 water closets, and 1 room whose purpose no one could remember. Each dormitory housed between 3 and 5 children, depending on their size and the number of beds that hadn't broken that particular month. The beds were made of wood that had been painted brown to hide the fact that they were constructed from whatever scraps of lumber had been available at the time of construction. Each bed came equipped with 1 mattress, stuffed with straw that was replaced annually whether it needed it or not, 1 pillow, stuffed with feathers from birds whose species had never been identified, 1 blanket, woven from wool that came from sheep of questionable health, and 1 chamber pot, made from clay by a potter who clearly resented his profession. The daily routine at St. Bartholomew's was as follows, recorded here in its entirety because documenting tedium is what we do here. 5:30 a.m., wake-up bell, rung by whoever drew the short straw the night before. 5:45 a.m., morning prayers, led by visiting clergy who clearly didn't want to be there. 6:15 a.m., morning ablutions, a fancy word for washing with cold water. 6:45 a.m., breakfast, porridge of indeterminate grain origin. 7:30 a.m., morning chores, sweeping, scrubbing and other activities designed to build character. 9:00 a.m., educational instruction, reading, writing and basic arithmetic taught by Mrs. Describington, who had learned to read at the advanced age of 23. 12:00 p.m., midday meal, bread, weak broth and occasionally something that might have once been vegetables. 1:00 p.m., afternoon chores, more sweeping, more scrubbing, and the occasional mending of items that were beyond repair. 3:00 p.m., free time, a generous term for sitting quietly and contemplating the ceiling. 5:00 p.m., evening meal, the same as the midday meal but colder. 6:00 p.m., evening prayers, identical to morning prayers but with more yawning. 6:30 p.m., personal time, washing, mending clothes and writing letters to relatives who never wrote back. 8:00 p.m., bedtime, lights out, enforced by Mrs. Describington's patrol. This schedule was followed 364 days per year. The exception was Christmas Day, when the routine was modified in ways so subtle that you might miss them if you blinked, which brings us to the actual subject of this video, though we're still quite far from getting there. But before we can discuss Christmas morning 1687, we must first understand the political climate of England at the time. King James II was on the throne, having assumed power in 1685 following the death of his brother, King Charles II, who died of what historians politely call natural causes, but which were probably related to his lifestyle of excess, a lifestyle that stood in stark contrast to the Spartan conditions at St. Bartholomew's home for foundling children. The religious tensions of the era were particularly relevant to our story, though in ways that won't become clear until much later in this video. James II was Catholic, which made many of his Protestant subjects uncomfortable, though this discomfort was nothing compared to the discomfort experienced by orphans sleeping on straw mattresses in unheated dormitories during December. The economic conditions of 1687 were what economists would later describe as not great, though this technical term doesn't capture the full scope of the situation. Unemployment was high, wages were low, and the price of bread had increased by 12% over the previous year, a fact that directly impacted the orphanage's food budget and, by extension, the thickness of the evening broth. Trade with the colonies was booming, particularly in tobacco, sugar and other commodities that the orphans would never see, taste or afford. The wealthy were getting wealthier, the poor were getting poorer, and the orphans were maintaining their position at the very bottom of the social hierarchy with admirable consistency. Scientific progress was being made during this period, though none of it benefited the orphans. Isaac Newton had recently published his Principia Mathematica, introducing the world to his laws of motion and universal gravitation. These laws, while revolutionary for our understanding of physics, did nothing to improve the quality of orphanage porridge. The arts were flourishing as well. Henry Purcell was composing operas that the orphans would never hear. Christopher Wren was designing churches they would never enter, except for the one attached to their own orphanage, which was notably less grand. And poets were writing verses about love, nature, and beauty, concepts that were largely foreign to children, whose daily existence was defined by institutional grey walls and the persistent smell of boiled cabbage. Speaking of cabbage, the orphanage garden produced exactly 7 vegetables: turnips, parsnips, onions, cabbage, leeks, carrots, and something that might have been radishes but could equally have been small, disappointed turnips. The garden was tended by the older orphans under the supervision of Mr. Cornelius Grudgewort, the groundskeeper, who had been employed at the orphanage for 17 years and had never once been observed smiling. Mr. Grudgewort lived in a small cottage on the orphanage grounds, which he shared with 3 cats whose names he refused to reveal, claiming that naming animals led to unnecessary emotional attachment. The cats were grey, which matched both the building and Mr. Grudgewort's disposition. The cottage itself was a study in architectural minimalism, containing 1 room that served as bedroom, sitting room, kitchen, and storage area. Mr. Grudgewort owned exactly 23 possessions, which he had counted repeatedly and could list from memory. 1 bed, 1 chair, 1 table, 1 cooking pot, 1 ladle, 1 bowl, 1 spoon, 1 knife, 1 lantern, 3 blankets, 1 pillow, 1 Bible, 1 almanac, 1 pair of boots, 1 extra pair of stockings, 1 winter coat, 1 hat, 1 walking stick, and 1 small mirror that he used for shaving and immediately looked away from, presumably to avoid confronting his own reflection. But I digress, or perhaps I don't. The line between relevant information and meaningless detail becomes increasingly blurred when discussing the mundane, which is precisely the point of this exercise in narrative endurance. The orphanage's funding came from 3 sources: a small government stipend that was occasionally paid on time, donations from local merchants who received tax benefits for their charitable contributions, and the proceeds from the sale of items produced by the orphans during their afternoon chores. These items included poorly knitted scarves, inadequately carved wooden spoons, and candles that burned unevenly and smoked excessively. The financial records of the orphanage, kept in Mrs. Describington's careful handwriting, show that in 1687 the institution's total income was £47, 12 shillings and 8 pence. Their total expenses were £47, 12 shillings and 7 pence, leaving a profit of exactly 1 penny, which Mrs. Describington saved in a small jar on her desk for what she called emergency purposes, though no one could imagine what emergency could be resolved with a single penny. The orphanage's library consisted of 12 books: the Bible, a collection of moral tales entitled Improving Stories for Young Minds, a treatise on proper penmanship, a guide to basic arithmetic, a cookbook with recipes that required ingredients the orphanage could never afford, a book of hymns with several pages missing, a dictionary that had been published 30 years earlier and was missing the letters F through J, a farmer's almanac from 1682, a collection of sermons by a preacher who had died, of boredom, a book about the proper care of turnips, a guide to medicinal herbs, most of which did not grow in the orphanage garden, and a volume of poetry that someone had left behind and which no one had ever opened. These books were stored in a wooden cabinet in Mrs. Describington's office and were available to the children during their free time, though borrowing required filling out a form in triplicate and providing a detailed explanation of why the book was needed, which discouraged most potential readers. The educational curriculum at St. Bartholomew's was designed to prepare the children for lives of useful employment, which in practice meant teaching them to read simple words, write their names, add and subtract numbers up to 100, and perform basic tasks that would make them attractive to potential employers or adoptive families. The success rate of this program was difficult to measure, since the orphanage didn't maintain contact with children after they left, but Mrs. Describington estimated that approximately 60% of former residents achieved what she called adequate integration into society, which was her euphemistic way of saying they didn't end up in prison or dead in a ditch. The medical care at the orphanage was provided by Dr. Septimus Barely Adequate, who visited once per week unless there was an emergency, in which case he visited twice per week, but charged double his usual fee. Dr. Barely Adequate had received his medical training at a school whose name he preferred not to mention, and his treatments consisted primarily of bloodletting, purging, and the application of poultices made from whatever herbs were available in the garden. His medical bag contained the following items: 1 set of bloodletting knives, 1 cupping set, 12 glass vials containing liquids of various colors and questionable efficacy, 1 mortar and pestle, 1 pair of tweezers, 1 magnifying glass, 1 stethoscope that didn't work properly, 1 thermometer that gave inconsistent readings, and 1 bottle of laudanum that he kept for severe cases, which he defined as cases where the patient's moaning was disturbing other children's sleep. The death rate at the orphanage was approximately 8% per year, which was considered acceptable by 17th century standards, but would be deeply concerning by contemporary metrics. Causes of death included consumption, pneumonia, dysentery, accidents involving farm tools, and what Dr. Barely Adequate diagnosed as failure to thrive, which was his catch-all term for cases where children simply seemed to lose the will to continue existing. Burials took place in a small cemetery behind the orphanage, marked by wooden crosses that rarely lasted more than 5 years before weather and insects rendered them illegible. The cemetery contained approximately 200 graves, though the exact number was unknown because record-keeping in the early years had been inconsistent, and several of the records had been damaged in a flood that occurred in 1679. The flood, incidentally, had been caused by a blocked drainage ditch that had been neglected due to budgetary constraints. The water had reached a maximum depth of 3 inches throughout the ground floor of the main building, causing damage to the floors, walls, and Mrs. Describington's collection of improving literature for young minds. The repair costs had exceeded the orphanage's annual maintenance budget, resulting in several years of deferred upgrades to essential systems. But we've wandered rather far from our central topic, haven't we? Though in a video about the profound monotony of institutional Christmas morning, perhaps wandering is the point. After all, boredom is rarely a straight line from point A to point B. It's more often a meandering path through point C, point Q, point X, and several points that don't exist on any rational map. We'll return to Christmas morning, 1687, eventually. But first, we need to understand the sleeping arrangements. The sleeping arrangements at St. Bartholomew's were governed by a complex set of rules that had evolved over the orphanage's 14 years of operation. These rules, while never formally written down, were understood by all residents and violated at one's own peril. Rule number 1. Beds were assigned based on length of residence, with newer arrivals receiving beds closest to the windows, which were colder in winter and hotter in summer. This might seem counterintuitive. Shouldn't seniority be rewarded with better conditions? But Mrs. Describington operated on the principle that comfort led to complacency, and complacency led to moral decay. Rule number 2. No child could claim ownership of any bed permanently. Assignments could be changed at any time for disciplinary reasons, space optimization, or what Mrs. Describington called character development opportunities. These reassignments occurred approximately once every 6 weeks, ensuring that no child became too attached to their particular sleeping location. Rule number 3. Personal belongings could be stored under the bed in a single wooden box provided by the orphanage. These boxes measured exactly 12 inches by 8 inches by 6 inches, and anything that didn't fit was considered unnecessary and subject to confiscation. Most children owned fewer possessions than the box could hold anyway, so this limitation was more theoretical than practical. Rule number 4. Talking after lights out was forbidden and punishable by assignment to early morning chamber pot cleaning duty. This rule was enforced by the older children, who were given the responsibility of monitoring their dormitory mates in exchange for slightly better food portions, a system that created a hierarchy of surveillance that would have impressed the most paranoid monarch. Rule number 5. Bedwetting was grounds for public humiliation, specifically requiring the offending child to announce their transgression at the next meal and publicly apologize to their dormitory mates for the inconvenience. This policy, while effective in reducing repeat incidents, also contributed to the general atmosphere of anxiety that permeated the orphanage. But let's examine the physical construction of these beds in excruciating detail, because if we're going to spend 2 hours discussing Christmas morning in an orphanage, we might as well understand exactly what the children were sleeping on. Each bed frame was constructed from pine wood that had been painted with a brown paint made from mixing ochre clay with linseed oil and a small amount of lamp black. The paint had been applied in 1674, 3 years before Edmund Dulsworth III died, and left the ongoing maintenance of the orphanage to his son Edmund Dulsworth IV, who had inherited his family's commitment to parsimony but not their sense of social responsibility. The bed frames measured 6 feet in length by 2 feet 8 inches in width, dimensions that accommodated most children comfortably until they reached approximately age 14, at which point they either left the orphanage or learned to sleep with their knees permanently bent. The frame stood 18 inches off the ground, providing storage space underneath and discouraging the rats that occasionally found their way into the building during cold weather. Each frame was constructed using mortise and tenon joints, a technique that was both durable and economical, but required skilled craftsmanship. The original carpenter, a man named Augustus Adequately Skilled, had been hired specifically for this project and had completed all 52 bed frames, 47 in use, 5 in storage for replacements, in exactly 73 days during the summer of 1674. Augustus Adequately Skilled was a craftsman of moderate ability who charged reasonable prices and delivered work that was satisfactory without being exceptional. He lived in the village of Little Tedium, approximately 3 miles from the orphanage, with his wife, Constance Adequately Skilled, and their 4 children, Augustus Jr., Constance Jr., Geoffrey, and Margaret. His workshop contained the standard tools of his trade: saws, chisels, planes, squares, measuring rules, and a workbench that had been built by his father, Augustus Barely Skilled, whose work was notably inferior to his son's. The wood for the bed frames had been purchased from Pemberton's Lumber Emporium, a business owned by Harold Pemberton, who had inherited it from his father, Marcus Pemberton, who had founded it in 1634 after discovering that he was allergic to farming, but had an aptitude for selecting trees. Harold Pemberton employed 6 workers, 2 sawyers, 2 oxen drivers, 1 clerk and 1 apprentice whose name no one bothered to learn because apprentices were replaced frequently, and learning their names was considered an inefficient use of mental resources. The lumber yard contained approximately 2,400 board feet of various wood types at any given time, though this inventory fluctuated based on seasonal demand and the unpredictable availability of suitable trees. The pine used for the orphanage beds had been cut from trees that had been growing for approximately 40 years in a forest that had been managed by the same family for 3 generations. But I'm getting distracted by lumber when what we really need to discuss is the mattresses. Or perhaps the distraction is the point. After all, the children lying on these beds on Christmas morning, 1687, were probably thinking about everything except Christmas. The mattresses were stuffed with straw that was replaced annually in September, which meant that by December, the straw had been compressed by 3 months of use into a relatively firm sleeping surface. The straw came from local farms and was of the type typically used for animal bedding, which was practical if not particularly comfortable. Each mattress was covered with a cloth ticking made from hemp that had been woven by women in the village who supplemented their household income with textile work. The ticking was sewn using a simple running stitch with linen thread, and each mattress required approximately 4 yards of fabric and 200 yards of thread. The sewing was done by Mrs. Hortense Needlestein, who charged 2 shillings per mattress and could complete 1 mattress every 3 days, working at her usual pace. Mrs. Hortense Needlestein was a widow who had learned her sewing skills from her mother, who had learned them from a book entitled The Complete Guide to Domestic Needle Arts, which had been written by someone whose identity was lost to history, but whose influence lived on in the strait, even stitches that held together the orphans' bedding. The pillows were stuffed with feathers collected from geese, ducks, and chickens that had been raised on local farms and slaughtered for food. The feathers were cleaned by boiling them in water with soap, then dried in the sun for several days, before being stuffed into pillowcases made from the same hemp ticking as the mattresses. Each pillow contained approximately 2 pounds of feathers, which provided adequate support for a child's head while remaining economical to produce. The blankets were woven from wool that came from sheep raised on the Dulsworth estate, which encompassed 847 acres of rolling hills, meadows and woodlands that had been in the family for 4 generations. The estate supported 312 sheep, 43 cattle, 27 pigs, 156 chickens, 3 horses, 1 ox, and an unknown number of cats who were responsible for controlling the rodent population. The wool was sheared annually in late spring by professional shearers who travelled from farm to farm with their tools and expertise. The shearing of the Dulsworth flock took exactly 2.5 days and yielded approximately 890 pounds of raw wool, which was then processed through a series of steps that were as tedious as they were necessary. First, the wool was sorted by quality, with the finest fibres reserved for garments that would be worn by the Dulsworth family, and the coarser fibres designated for utilitarian purposes like orphanage blankets. The sorting was done by women who had developed the ability to assess wool quality by touch, a skill that took years to master and provided employment for approximately 12 women from the surrounding villages. Next, the wool was washed to remove lanolin, dirt, and other impurities. This process involved soaking the wool in large wooden vats filled with water that had been heated over open fires and mixed with soap made from ash and animal fat. The washing required constant stirring and multiple rinses, and the entire process took approximately 1 week to complete. After washing, the wool was dried by spreading it on wooden frames in a well-ventilated building constructed specifically for this purpose. The drying time varied based on weather conditions, but typically took between 3 and 7 days. During this time, the wool had to be turned regularly to ensure even drying and prevent mold growth. Once dry, the wool was combed to align the fibers and remove any remaining impurities. The combing was done using metal combs with long, closely spaced teeth and required considerable skill to avoid damaging the fibers. The combed wool was then ready for spinning, which was done by women who worked in their homes using spinning wheels that had been passed down through their families. The spinning process converted the raw wool fibers into continuous yarn that could be woven into fabric. This was done by feeding small amounts of combed wool onto a spinning wheel while simultaneously drawing out and twisting the fibers into a continuous thread. An experienced spinner could produce approximately 4 ounces of yarn per day, working at a steady pace. The yarn was then dyed using colors derived from natural sources: brown from walnut hulls, gray from iron, yellow from onion skins, red from madder root, and blue from woad plants that were grown specifically for this purpose. The dyeing process involved boiling the yarn in large pots with the coloring agents and various mordants that helped the colors bind to the wool fibers. Finally, the dyed yarn was woven into blanket fabric using looms operated by professional weavers who had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship. The weaving created a plain weave pattern that was durable and warm while remaining economical to produce. Each blanket required approximately 3 pounds of yarn and took one weaver 2 days to complete. The finished blankets measured 60 inches by 72 inches, which was large enough to cover a child completely, while allowing for the fact that children grow and blankets shrink. The blankets were expected to last for approximately 5 years with normal use, though some lasted longer, and others succumbed to wear, washing, and the occasional bout of dysentery that required extensive cleaning. But here's where things get interesting, or as interesting as they can get, when discussing institutional bedding in the 17th century. We'll return to this thought later, but first, let me tell you about the chamber pots. Each child was provided with a ceramic chamber pot that served as their personal toilet during the night hours, when leaving the dormitory was forbidden. These pots were manufactured by the Grimsby Pottery Works, a business that had been producing utilitarian ceramics for local institutions since 1641. The pottery was owned and operated by Master Potter Jeremiah Grimsby, who had learned his trade from his father, Master Potter Cornelius Grimsby, who had in turn learned from his father, Master Potter Augustus Grimsby, who had founded the business after discovering that he had a natural talent for working with clay, but an unfortunate tendency to drop anything made from other materials. The Grimsby Pottery Works employed 7 people: Master Potter Jeremiah Grimsby, his son and heir apparent Cornelius Grimsby Jr., 2 experienced potters named Harold Mudneck and Samuel Clayfingers, 1 apprentice potter whose name changed approximately every 6 months due to high turnover, 1 glazer named Beatrice Shinymop, and 1 general labourer whose job involved digging clay, hauling water, and loading kilns with finished pottery. The clay used for the chamber pots was dug from a pit located approximately 2 miles from the pottery works on land that had been in the Grimsby family since 1612. The clay pit produced approximately 400 tons of usable clay per year, which was enough to meet the pottery's production needs, while leaving a surplus that could be sold to other potters in the region. The process of making a chamber pot began with preparing the clay, which involved mixing it with water to achieve the proper consistency, then kneading it by hand to remove air bubbles and ensure uniform texture. This preparation work was typically done by the apprentice, who needed to develop the arm strength and finger sensitivity required for more advanced pottery work. Once prepared, the clay was shaped on a potter's wheel using techniques that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen. The basic chamber pot form required approximately 15 minutes to shape, plus additional time for smoothing, adding a rim, and creating the pouring spout that would make emptying the pot slightly less unpleasant. After shaping, the pots were left to dry for 24 hours, during which time the clay would shrink slightly and become firm enough to handle without losing its shape. The drying time could be extended during humid weather or shortened during particularly dry conditions, requiring the potter to adjust his schedule accordingly. Once dry, the pots were fired in a kiln heated by wood fires that burned continuously for 12 hours, reaching temperatures of approximately 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The firing process required constant attention to maintain the proper temperature and ensure even heating throughout the kiln chamber. After firing, the pots were glazed with a lead-based glaze that made them waterproof and easier to clean. The glazing process involved dipping each pot in liquid glaze, allowing excess glaze to drain off, then firing the pots a second time at a slightly lower temperature to melt and set the glaze. The finished chamber pots were tested for leaks by filling them with water and observing them for 24 hours. Any pot that showed signs of leakage was discarded or sold at a reduced price for use as plant containers, though the market for ceramic plant containers was limited in the 17th century. The pots used at St. Bartholomew's were of standard design, approximately 8 inches in diameter at the rim, 6 inches tall, with a capacity of roughly 2 quarts. They were glazed in a brown color that was practical for hiding stains and matched the overall aesthetic of institutional furnishings throughout the orphanage. Each child was responsible for emptying and cleaning their own chamber pot every morning after wake-up, a task that was performed in a designated area behind the main building where there was a deep pit specifically dug for this purpose. The pit was emptied monthly by workers who were paid extra for this unpleasant but necessary service. The cleaning of chamber pots was done with water drawn from the orphanage well and a brush made from pig bristles attached to a wooden handle. The brushes were replaced monthly, or whenever they became too foul to be effective, whichever came first. But we're spending rather a lot of time on chamber pots, aren't we? Though I suppose when discussing what it was like to wake up in a 17th century orphanage, the chamber pot would have been one of the first things each child would have encountered upon opening their eyes on Christmas morning. Speaking of Christmas morning, we should probably discuss the religious observances at St. Bartholomew's, though they were notable more for their brevity than their spiritual significance. The orphanage was officially Church of England, which meant that the children received religious instruction that conformed to the established church's doctrines and practices. However, the quality and enthusiasm of this instruction varied considerably depending on which clergyman was available on any given Sunday. The orphanage did not have a permanent chaplain, primarily due to budgetary constraints, but also because serving as chaplain to a house full of orphans was not considered a particularly prestigious or career-advancing position within the church hierarchy. Instead, religious services were conducted by a rotating cast of local clergy who viewed the assignment as either a charitable duty or a penance, depending on their individual circumstances and attitudes. The most frequent celebrant was Reverend Dr. Septimus Drowsily Sincere, who had been ordained in 1669 after completing his theological education at a seminary whose reputation was adequate but not exceptional. Dr. Drowsily Sincere was a man of moderate height, moderate weight, moderate intelligence, and moderate enthusiasm for his calling, which made him perfectly suited for conducting religious services that were unlikely to inspire either religious fervor or theological controversy. Dr. Drowsily Sincere's sermons typically lasted between 15 and 20 minutes and focused on themes of moral improvement, social order, and the importance of accepting one's station in life with good grace. His delivery was notable for its consistency, the same measured pace, the same slight nasal quality, and the same tendency to pause at predictable intervals as if waiting for divine inspiration that never quite arrived. The second most frequent celebrant was Reverend Cornelius Barely Awake, an elderly clergyman who had been serving the local parish for 34 years and who approached his orphanage duties with the enthusiasm of a man who had long since concluded that life was a series of obligations to be endured rather than opportunities to be embraced. Reverend Barely Awake's sermons were shorter than Dr. Drowsily Sincere's, typically lasting no more than 10 minutes, and were characterized by their remarkable ability to say very little while appearing to say something important. His favorite topics included the virtue of patience, the necessity of hard work, and the mysterious ways of divine providence, themes that seemed particularly relevant when addressed to children who had been abandoned by their parents and were living in institutional poverty. The third most frequent celebrant was Father Benedict Monotonous, a Catholic priest who had converted to Anglicanism in 1679 for reasons that he never fully explained, but which probably involved career advancement opportunities that were unavailable to Catholics during the reign of a Protestant monarch. Father Monotonous brought to his orphanage services a commitment to theological precision that was admirable in its thoroughness and devastating in its effect on his audience's attention span. Father Monotonous's sermons were notable for their extensive use of biblical quotations, theological references, and complex doctrinal explanations that were entirely appropriate for an audience of seminary students, but somewhat less suitable for hungry, sleepy orphans, whose primary concerns were avoiding punishment and getting through another day without incident. The religious services at St. Bartholomew's followed the standard Anglican liturgy, modified only by the practical constraints of conducting worship in a dining hall that smelled of porridge and contained no musical instruments except for Mrs. Describington's voice, which she deployed for hymn singing with more enthusiasm than skill. The hymns sung at St. Bartholomew's were selected from a collection entitled Sacred Songs for Moral Improvement, which contained 47 hymns arranged in order of theological importance rather than musical quality. The most frequently sung hymns were O Lord, we thank Thee for our daily bread, sung before meals, though the quality of the bread did not always justify the gratitude expressed, Guide us, O Thou Great Provider, sung during evening prayers with particular emphasis on the word provide. We are but humble children, sung during morning prayers, emphasizing the children's proper place in the social hierarchy. The Lord provides for sparrows, sung during times of particular financial difficulty when even the orphanage's modest meals were threatened. Blessed are the meek, sung whenever Mrs. Describington felt that the children were displaying insufficient humility. The Christmas service at St. Bartholomew's was distinguished from regular Sunday services primarily by its length, which was extended by approximately 10 minutes to accommodate additional readings from the Gospel of Luke and the singing of two Christmas-specific hymns, Angels we have heard on high and O come, all ye faithful. However, the Christmas service was scheduled for 6 p.m. on Christmas Day, which meant that the children's Christmas morning experience was not significantly different from any other morning, except for one small detail that I'll mention in approximately 47 minutes. But before we get to Christmas morning itself, we should examine the children's daily routine in greater detail, because understanding their normal schedule is essential to appreciating how Christmas morning both did and did not deviate from their usual experience. The wake-up bell at St. Bartholomew's was rung by whichever child had been assigned bell duty for the week. This assignment rotated among the older children and was considered neither a privilege nor a punishment, simply another responsibility in an institutional life that was structured around responsibilities rather than pleasures. The bell itself was made of bronze and had been cast in 1674 by the Pemberton Bell Foundry, a business that had been operating since 1623 and had produced bells for churches, schools, and various institutions throughout the region. The bell weighed exactly 17 pounds and produced a tone that could be described as adequate for its purpose, without being particularly melodious. The bell was mounted on a wooden frame outside the main dormitory building and was rung by pulling a rope that extended through a pulley system into the building's main hallway. The child assigned to bell duty was required to ring the bell for exactly 30 seconds at 5:30 a.m., then again for 15 seconds at 5:35 a.m. for any children who had failed to respond to the initial wake-up call. The response time between the first bell and the appearance of all children in the main hallway was typically 4 minutes and 23 seconds, though this varied based on factors including the weather, the previous day's activities, and the general mood of the children, which itself was influenced by variables too numerous to catalogue here. Morning prayers were conducted in the dining hall because the chapel was too small to accommodate all 47 children, plus Mrs. Describington, and whatever clergyman was available on any given morning. The prayers followed a standard format that never varied. Opening hymn, 2 minutes 34 seconds on average. Reading from the Book of Common Prayer, 3 minutes 12 seconds. Responsive reading of Psalm 23, 1 minute 47 seconds. Silent prayer, 30 seconds. Though some children used this time for daydreaming or planning their strategy for avoiding extra chores. Closing hymn, 2 minutes 18 seconds on average. Announcements regarding the day's activities, disciplinary matters, or changes to the schedule. Variable duration, but typically 45 seconds unless someone was in serious trouble. The morning ablutions were performed in a washroom that contained 12 basins, 12 ewers for water, 12 towels that were washed weekly whether they needed it or not, and one mirror that was cracked but still functional for basic grooming purposes. The water for morning washing was drawn from the orphanage well by the children assigned to water duty, a responsibility that rotated weekly and required carrying approximately 24 gallons of water from the well to the washroom each morning. The water was cold year-round, which encouraged efficient washing and discouraged lingering over one's morning routine. Each child was allotted exactly 3 minutes for their morning ablutions, a time limit that was enforced by Mrs. Describington's pocket watch and her unwavering commitment to maintaining the schedule that governed every aspect of orphanage life. The breakfast routine was perhaps the most regimented part of the orphans' day, which is saying something considering that their entire existence was governed by rules, schedules, and procedures that would have impressed a military drill sergeant. Breakfast was served in the dining hall at exactly 6:45 a.m. and consisted of porridge made from oats, barley, or whatever grain was available at the lowest cost. The porridge was prepared by Mrs. Gwendolyn Stursalot, the orphanage cook, who had been employed in this capacity since 1680 and had achieved a level of consistency in her cooking that was remarkable for its absolute reliability. The porridge was always exactly the same temperature, thickness, and level of blandness. Mrs. Stursalot was a woman of few words and fewer facial expressions, who approached her culinary duties with the same methodical precision that a clockmaker might bring to assembling a timepiece. She arrived at the orphanage kitchen each morning at 5 a.m., lit the fires under the large cooking pots, and began the porridge preparation process that she had refined over 7 years of daily repetition. The porridge was served in wooden bowls that had been carved by local craftsmen and were replaced annually or whenever they cracked, whichever came first. Each child was provided with one wooden spoon, also carved locally, and was expected to clean their own bowl and spoon after each meal using water that had been heated for washing purposes. The children sat at 4 long wooden tables with 11 or 12 children per table, and were required to remain silent during meals, except when absolutely necessary communication was required. This silence was enforced by Mrs. Describington, who patrolled the dining hall during mealtimes with the vigilance of a prison guard and the temperament of someone who had spent too many years listening to institutional porridge being consumed by institutional spoons, scraping against institutional bowls. But we're dwelling on breakfast, when what we really need to understand is what happened when these children woke up on Christmas morning, 1687, and discovered that their world had been transformed by, well, let's just say that the transformation was subtle enough that most of them didn't notice it immediately. Actually, let me tell you about the washing facilities in more detail first, because the morning routine is crucial to understanding the children's state of mind when they eventually realized that this particular morning was different from all the others. The washroom was located on the ground floor of the main building, adjacent to the dining hall for practical reasons related to plumbing and efficiency. The room was 12 feet by 16 feet, with stone floors that were always slightly damp, and walls that had been painted white in 1675, but had since faded to a color that could best be described as institutional grey-white with water stains. The 12 washing basins were arranged along 2 walls, 6 basins per wall, each basin carved from local stone by a craftsman named Jeremiah Chiselworth, who had been commissioned specifically for this project and had completed all 12 basins in exactly 28 days during the autumn of 1673. Jeremiah Chiselworth was a stonemason of moderate skill who specialized in utilitarian projects rather than decorative work. He had learned his trade from his uncle, Marcus Chiselworth, who had learned from his father, Cornelius Chiselworth, who had founded the family stonemasonry business in 1634 after discovering that he had an unusual ability to see useful shapes hidden within blocks of raw stone. The stone used for the basins had been quarried from a site approximately 5 miles from the orphanage, on land owned by the Earl of Tediumshire, who charged a modest fee for quarrying rights and required that any stone removed from his land be used for projects that he deemed socially beneficial. The orphanage basins qualified for this exemption because they served a charitable purpose, and because the Earl's wife, the Countess of Tediumshire, had expressed the opinion that clean orphans were preferable to dirty ones. Each basin measured approximately 18 inches in diameter and 6 inches deep, which provided sufficient capacity for washing one's face, hands and neck without waste of water that might be needed for other purposes. The basins were fitted with simple wooden plugs that could be removed to drain the water after use, and the drainage system carried the used water to a collection pit outside the building, where it eventually soaked into the ground or evaporated, depending on weather conditions. The water ewers were made of pewter and had been purchased from Grimsby's Metalworks, a sister business to the pottery works mentioned earlier, at a cost of 3 shillings per ewer. Each ewer held approximately 5 quarts of water, which was sufficient for one child's morning ablutions if used efficiently. The towels were woven from linen by the same women who produced the mattress ticking, using thread that was slightly coarser than what would be used for clothing, but softer than what would be used for cleaning rags. Each towel measured 24 inches by 36 inches and was expected to last for 2 years with normal use, though some lasted longer if the children were particularly careful, and others needed replacement sooner if they were subjected to unusually harsh treatment. But here's the detail that you've been waiting for, though you probably didn't realize you were waiting for it. On Christmas morning, 1687, there was one additional towel in the washroom, a 13th towel hanging next to the mirror that was slightly different from all the others. This towel was made from the same linen as the other 12, woven by the same women using the same techniques, but it was dyed a very pale green color using dye made from mint leaves that had been grown in the orphanage garden, specifically for this purpose. The difference was so subtle that most of the children didn't notice it immediately, and those who did notice assumed that it was their imagination or a trick of the early morning light filtering through the washroom's single window. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We haven't even discussed how the children woke up on Christmas morning, and that's really where our story begins, even though we're already 54 minutes into this video and haven't properly started yet. Factually, before we can discuss Christmas morning, we need to understand what happened on Christmas Eve, because the events of the evening before had a subtle but significant impact on the children's sleep patterns and, consequently, on their experience of waking up on December 25th. Christmas Eve 1686, wait, that should be 1686. Christmas Eve 1686 was notable for several reasons that seemed insignificant at the time, but would prove to be quite important in ways that no one could have predicted. First, the weather was unusually warm for December, with temperatures reaching nearly 45 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon, warm enough that Mrs. Describington made the unprecedented decision to allow the children to spend their free time outdoors rather than sitting quietly in the common room contemplating the ceiling. This decision might seem like a small kindness, but it had profound effects on the children's physical and mental state. After 3 months of being confined indoors due to cold weather, the sudden freedom to run, play, and breathe fresh air resulted in a level of physical exhaustion that was unusual for the typically sedentary orphans. Second, Dr. Barely Adequate had made his weekly visit on December 23rd instead of his usual Tuesday appointment because his wife, Mrs. Constance Barely Adequate, had insisted that he should be home on Christmas Eve to help with preparations for their own family celebration. This schedule change meant that several children who had been suffering from minor ailments, nothing serious, just the usual collection of coughs, sniffles, and digestive complaints that were common in institutional settings, had received medical attention earlier than usual. Dr. Barely Adequate's treatments, while not particularly effective by modern standards, had included doses of laudanum for the children with persistent coughs. Laudanum, as you may know, is an opium-based medication that was commonly used in the 17th century for pain relief and cough suppression. While the doses administered to the children were small, they were sufficient to induce a state of relaxation that was unusual for orphans who were accustomed to chronic anxiety about their circumstances. Third, Mrs. Sturcelot had received a delivery of ingredients on December 23rd that included several items not normally available at the orphanage. The delivery had been made by mistake. It was actually intended for the household of Sir Edmund Dulsworth IV, but by the time the error was discovered, it was too late to return the goods without them spoiling. The erroneous delivery included 2 pounds of raisins, 1 pound of brown sugar, 3 oranges, 1 small barrel of ale, 2 pounds of butter, 1 pound of flour that was significantly finer than the usual institutional grade, and 1 small container of cinnamon that had been imported from Ceylon at considerable expense. Mrs. Sturcelot, faced with this unexpected bounty, and knowing that she would be held responsible if the goods spoiled, made the decision to incorporate these ingredients into the Christmas Eve evening meal. This resulted in a dinner that was dramatically different from the usual institutional fare: porridge enhanced with butter and brown sugar, bread that was noticeably lighter and more flavorful than usual, and a pudding made with raisins, cinnamon, and ale that was unlike anything the children had ever tasted. The effects of this improved meal on children who were accustomed to institutional blandness cannot be overstated. The combination of richer food, the mild intoxicating effects of the ale, even in small quantities, and the psychological impact of receiving something that felt like a treat created a state of contentment that was entirely foreign to their usual experience. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, Father Benedict Monotonous had been scheduled to conduct the Christmas Eve service, but had fallen ill with what his housekeeper described as an attack of the vapors, which was a polite way of saying that he had consumed too much Christmas punch at a gathering hosted by the local magistrate and was in no condition to perform his religious duties. The replacement clergyman was Father Timothy, surprisingly enthusiastic, a young priest who had recently completed his theological education and was still possessed of the optimism and energy that institutional religion had not yet managed to suppress. Father, surprisingly enthusiastic, approached his orphanage assignment with genuine pleasure rather than resigned duty, and this difference in attitude was immediately apparent to the children. Instead of the usual abbreviated evening service, Father, surprisingly enthusiastic, conducted a full Christmas Eve celebration that included special readings, additional hymns, and, most remarkably, a brief but heartfelt homily about the significance of the Christmas story that was delivered with actual emotion and conviction, rather than the usual perfunctory recitation of theological platitudes. The psychological effect of being addressed as if they were worth the effort of genuine religious instruction, rather than being merely another institutional obligation, was profound for children who were accustomed to being treated as administrative problems, rather than human souls worthy of spiritual attention. But the most significant event of Christmas Eve was something that didn't happen, which makes it difficult to describe but essential to understand if we're going to comprehend what the children experienced when they woke up the following morning. What didn't happen was the usual bedtime inspection. Mrs. Describington's bedtime inspection was a daily ritual that involved her walking through each dormitory with a lantern, checking that all children were in their assigned beds, that chamber pots were properly positioned, that personal belongings were stored in their designated boxes, and that no unauthorized conversations were taking place. This inspection typically took place at 8:15 p.m. and was conducted with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had performed the same task every night for 14 years. Mrs. Describington would enter each dormitory, count the children, make note of any irregularities, issue quiet corrections for minor infractions, and assign additional chores for more serious violations of dormitory rules. The inspection served multiple purposes. It ensured compliance with institutional regulations. It provided Mrs. Describington with information about the children's health and behavior that might require attention the following day, and it established the evening atmosphere of surveillance and control that was essential to maintaining discipline in an institution housing 47 children with minimal adult supervision. On Christmas Eve, however, Mrs. Describington was delayed by the need to supervise the cleanup after the unexpected feast that Mrs. Sturcelot had provided. The richer food had created more dishes to wash, more surfaces to clean, and more potential for stomach upsets that might require medical attention during the night. By the time she had finished dealing with these practical concerns and had secured the kitchen against nocturnal raids by children who might still be excited by their unusual dining experience, it was nearly 9:30 p.m., well past the time when lights were supposed to be out and all children asleep. Rather than conducting her usual inspection and risking the disruption of children who had for once settled into sleep without the usual complaints and delays, Mrs. Describington made the unprecedented decision to skip the bedtime inspection entirely. This decision, while practical under the circumstances, had consequences that she could not have anticipated. The children, accustomed to ending each day with the reminder of institutional oversight and control, instead fell asleep without that final assertion of authority. For the first time in their institutional experience, they went to sleep feeling as if they had been trusted to behave appropriately without direct supervision. The psychological effects of this trust, combined with the physical effects of better food, outdoor exercise, laudanum, and genuine religious attention, created a state of relaxation and contentment that was entirely unprecedented in their experience at St. Bartholomew's. And so on the night of December 24th, 1686, 47 orphaned children fell asleep in a state of unusual peace and well-being, their sleep deeper and more restful than any night since their arrival at the orphanage. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that while they slept, something was happening that would make their Christmas morning subtly but significantly different from every other morning of their institutional lives. I won't tell you what it was yet, because anticipation is the only thing keeping you watching at this point, and we still have another hour and 23 minutes to fill before this video reaches its promised 2-hour duration. Instead, let me tell you about the dreams that some of the children had that night, because their dreams would influence how they interpreted what they saw when they woke up on Christmas morning. Agnes Wobblefoot, who slept in the bed closest to the east window in dormitory 3, dreamed that she was walking through a garden where all the plants were made of green glass that chimed softly when touched by the wind. The dream was vivid and peaceful, and she woke with the unusual sensation of having experienced something beautiful rather than the usual anxiety-laden dreams that plagued most orphans. Albert Sniffles, whose bed was positioned next to the door in dormitory 1, dreamed that he was reading a book whose pages turned themselves and whose words rearranged themselves to tell different stories as he watched. In his dream, he could read perfectly, despite his real-life struggles with literacy, and the stories were about children who discovered that their circumstances could change in ways they had never imagined. Bartholomew Dampnose, who suffered from chronic nightmares related to the circumstances that had brought him to the orphanage, had his first peaceful night's sleep in 3 years. Instead of the usual terrifying dreams about abandonment and persecution, he dreamed of sitting by a warm fire while someone he couldn't quite see read aloud from a book of pleasant stories. The pattern was consistent throughout all 12 dormitories. Children who normally experienced restless, anxious sleep instead had dreams that were peaceful, hopeful, and filled with imagery that was unlike anything in their actual experience. The dreams weren't identical, but they shared common themes of unexpected beauty, hidden possibilities, and the sensation of being valued and cared for. These dreams were significant not because they predicted anything that would happen on Christmas morning, but because they created an emotional and psychological state that would influence how the children interpreted their waking experience. Children who woke from pleasant dreams were more likely to notice subtle positive changes in their environment, while children who woke from nightmares were more likely to focus on potential threats and disappointments. On Christmas morning 1687, every child in St. Bartholomew's Home for Foundling Children woke from pleasant dreams. The bell rang at exactly 5:30 a.m., as it did every morning, rung by Quincy Halfawake, whose turn it was to serve as bell ringer for the week. But Quincy, still influenced by his unusually restful sleep and pleasant dreams, rang the bell with more energy and enthusiasm than usual, creating a sound that seemed somehow more musical and less institutional than the typical wake-up call. The children's response to the bell was also different from usual. Instead of the groans, complaints, and slow movements that typically characterize the wake-up process, most of the children sat up immediately and looked around with an alertness that was unusual for institutional wake-ups. And that's when they began to notice that something was different. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't immediately obvious, but there were small changes throughout the orphanage that hadn't been there when they went to sleep on Christmas Eve. In Dormitory 1, Margaret Sleepy Eyes was the first to notice that there was a sprig of evergreen hanging from the ceiling above the washstand. It was small, just 3 small branches tied together with a piece of string, but it was definitely new, and it filled the room with a subtle scent of pine that was entirely different from the usual institutional smells of soap, straw, and wool. In Dormitory 5, Thomas Badewrinkle noticed that someone had placed a single holly berry on the windowsill. Just one berry, bright red against the grey stone, but clearly intentional, and clearly not something that had been there the night before. In Dormitory 8, the children woke to discover that their chamber pots had been arranged in a perfect circle around the room, instead of being lined up against the wall as usual. It was a small change, but it suggested that someone had been in their room during the night, moving things for reasons that were not immediately apparent. Throughout the orphanage, similar small changes were discovered as the children woke and began their morning routines. A piece of red ribbon tied to a door handle, an arrangement of pine cones on a table, a single candle that hadn't been lit, but had been placed in a location where no candle had been before. The changes were so subtle that they might have been overlooked on any other morning, but the children's enhanced state of alertness, combined with their pleasant dreams and the memory of the previous evening's unusual kindnesses, made them more observant than usual. And then came the moment that would be remembered by every child present for the rest of their lives, though at the time it seemed like just another small surprise in a morning that was full of them. When the children assembled in the dining hall for morning prayers, they discovered that Mrs. Describington was wearing a dress that none of them had ever seen before. It wasn't dramatically different from her usual institutional grey dress. It was still made of practical fabric in a sensible style, appropriate for a woman of her position and responsibilities, but it was green, a very pale green, hardly more than a hint of colour, but definitely green rather than grey. Mrs. Describington offered no explanation for this change. She conducted the morning prayers exactly as she always did, with the same words, the same timing, and the same measured pace. But the pale green dress suggested that even she had been affected by something that made Christmas morning different from all other mornings. The children exchanged glances, but said nothing. In an institution where any deviation from routine was potentially significant, they had learned to observe changes carefully before drawing conclusions about their meaning or importance. But as the morning prayers concluded and they prepared to proceed to the washroom for their morning ablutions, Mrs. Describington made an announcement that was both completely unexpected and utterly in character for her approach to institutional management. "Today," she said, in the same flat tone she used for all announcements, "you will wash your faces with water that has been warmed." The children stared at her in silence, trying to process this information. Warm water for washing was unprecedented in their experience at St. Bartholomew's. The practical implications were staggering. Someone had risen early to heat water specifically for their comfort, which suggested a level of consideration for their well-being that was entirely foreign to institutional routine. Furthermore, Mrs. Describington continued, "After breakfast, you will return to your dormitories and remain there until the midday meal. You are not to perform your usual morning chores. You are not to clean, sweep, or mend anything. You are simply to rest." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. 47 children, who had never experienced a morning without assigned tasks, tried to comprehend what it would mean to have time that was not structured around institutional needs. Finally, Mrs. Describington said, "You should know that Father, surprisingly enthusiastic, will be conducting not only this evening's Christmas service, but also a special midday service that will include music and readings that are not part of our usual liturgy." With these announcements complete, she dismissed them to the washroom, where they discovered not only the promised warm water, but also the 13th towel that I mentioned earlier, the one that was dyed the same pale green as Mrs. Describington's dress. And that, dear viewer who has inexplicably remained watching for the past 78 minutes, is how Christmas morning began at St. Bartholomew's Home for Foundling Children in 1687. Not with drama or excitement, but with small kindnesses and subtle changes that transformed the ordinary routine of institutional life into something that felt, for perhaps the first time in these children's lives, like care. But we're still quite far from understanding what it was really like to wake up in that orphanage on that particular morning, because the experience of institutional Christmas morning cannot be separated from the broader context of institutional life, which brings us to our next section. Actually, first, let me tell you about those warm water arrangements in exhaustive detail, because if we're going to spend 2 hours on this topic, we might as well understand exactly how unprecedented this gesture really was. The heating of water for the children's morning ablutions on Christmas Day, 1687, required logistical planning that began at approximately 4 a.m. when Mrs. Sturcelot arrived at the orphanage kitchen to begin preparations that were entirely outside her normal responsibilities. Mrs. Sturcelot, as we established earlier, was a woman of few words and methodical habits who approached her culinary duties with the precision of a military quartermaster. However, the decision to provide warm water for the children's Christmas morning washing represented a departure from routine that required her to completely reorganize her normal morning schedule. Under ordinary circumstances, Mrs. Sturcelot's morning routine began with lighting the kitchen fires and beginning porridge preparation, a process that had been refined over 7 years into a series of actions that could be performed with minimal conscious attention. On Christmas morning, however, she had to coordinate her usual porridge preparation with the additional task of heating approximately 18 gallons of water to a temperature that would be warm but not scalding when the children arrived at the washroom at 6:15 a.m. The mathematics of this operation were more complex than they might initially appear. Water drawn from the orphanage well in December had a temperature of approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit. To heat this water to a comfortable washing temperature of 85 degrees Fahrenheit required raising the temperature by 43 degrees, which, given the volume involved and the primitive heating methods available, required careful timing and fuel management. The orphanage kitchen contained 2 large iron pots that could each hold approximately 10 gallons of water, but these were normally used for porridge preparation and soup cooking. Using them for water heating meant that Mrs. Sturcelot had to modify her cooking schedule to accommodate both their usual food preparation functions and their temporary water heating role. The solution she devised was to heat the water in stages, using the larger pot to heat 9 gallons of water to near boiling temperature, then mixing this with 9 gallons of cold water in large wooden buckets to achieve the desired temperature. This process had to be repeated twice to heat the full 18 gallons needed for all 47 children. The fuel requirements for this operation were significant. The kitchen normally consumed approximately 12 pounds of wood per day for cooking purposes. Heating the additional water required an extra 8 pounds of wood, which represented a nearly 70% increase in daily fuel consumption. This additional wood had to be cut and split by someone, and since the regular groundskeeper, Mr. Cornelius Grudgewort, was not scheduled to work on Christmas Day, the task fell to Mrs. Sturcelot herself. This meant that Mrs. Sturcelot's Christmas morning began at 3:30 a.m. with wood cutting, followed by fire lighting at 4 a.m., water heating from 4:15 to 5:45 a.m., and porridge preparation from 5:45 to 6:45 a.m., a schedule that required her to work continuously for more than 3 hours before the children even woke up. The transportation of heated water from the kitchen to the washroom presented additional logistical challenges. The distance between the 2 rooms was approximately 40 feet, and the route included a narrow hallway and 2 doorways that were not wide enough to accommodate the large pots used for heating. Mrs. Sturcelot solved this problem by using a series of smaller containers that could be carried individually, 6 pewter jugs that each held 3 gallons of water, requiring a total of 6 trips to transport all the heated water from kitchen to washroom. Each jug weighed approximately 25 pounds when full, which meant that Mrs. Sturcelot carried a total of 150 pounds of heated water in 25-pound increments over the course of 15 minutes. The timing of this water transportation was critical. If the water was moved too early, it would cool to an unacceptable temperature before the children arrived. If it was moved too late, the children would be kept waiting, which would disrupt the carefully maintained schedule that governed all aspects of orphanage life. Mrs. Sturcelot calculated that water heated to 95 degrees Fahrenheit would cool to approximately 85 degrees during the 15-minute transportation and distribution process, accounting for heat loss due to exposure to cold air, contact with metal containers, and the time required to pour the water into individual washing basins. But the complexity didn't end with heating and transportation. The washroom's 12 stone basins had to be prepared to receive the heated water, which required cleaning them more thoroughly than usual to ensure that no residual soap or dirt would contaminate the water that had been prepared at such considerable effort. This cleaning was performed by Margaret Sleepy Eyes and Dorothy Smallvoice, who had been quietly awakened at 5 a.m. and asked to assist with preparations. The girls were sworn to secrecy about their early morning duties, not because there was anything shameful about the warm water preparations, but because Mrs. Describington wanted to maintain the surprise element of the Christmas morning changes. Margaret and Dorothy's cleaning duties required them to scrub each basin with soap and sand, rinse with cold water, and dry with clean cloths before the heated water arrived. This preparation took approximately 30 minutes and had to be completed in near darkness to avoid waking the other children prematurely. The distribution of heated water into the 12 basins had to account for the fact that some children would use the washroom before others, and water that sat in stone basins would cool more rapidly than water in pewter jugs. Mrs. Sturcelot's solution was to fill only 6 basins initially, keeping the remaining water in covered jugs that could be used to refill basins or fill the remaining 6 basins as needed. The actual temperature of the water when the first child, Agnes Wobblefoot, began her morning ablutions was 83 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees cooler than the target temperature, but still dramatically warmer than the usual cold water that the children were accustomed to using. Agnes's reaction to the warm water was recorded in a diary that she began keeping later that year, and which was discovered in the Orphanage archives in 1923. Her entry for December 25, 1687 reads, "The water was warm like summer rain, and I thought perhaps I was still dreaming, but Dorothy Smallvoice was there, and she whispered that it was real warm water, not a dream, and I put my whole face in it, and it felt like kindness." The psychological impact of this warm water experience cannot be overstated. For children who had never experienced institutional kindness that served no administrative purpose, the warm water represented a form of care that was entirely unprecedented in their experience at St. Bartholomew's. But the warm water was just the beginning of Christmas morning's departures from routine. The instructions to return to dormitories after breakfast, rather than beginning morning chores, represented an even more dramatic change to the children's daily experience. The concept of unstructured time was foreign to children, whose every waking moment was typically governed by institutional schedules, assigned tasks, and the constant awareness that idleness was considered morally dangerous and practically wasteful. The children's return to their dormitories after breakfast created a situation that none of them had ever experienced. Being in their sleeping spaces during daylight hours with no assigned activities and no immediate supervision. The psychological effects of this unprecedented freedom were immediate and profound. In Dormitory 1, the children initially sat on their beds in silence, unsure whether this new freedom was genuine or some kind of test of their behavior. Albert Sniffles later wrote that the silence lasted for approximately 10 minutes before anyone dared to speak, and even then, the first words were whispered questions. "Are we really supposed to just stay here?" And, "Do you think we're in trouble?" In Dormitory 3, Agnes Wobblefoot began examining the sprig of evergreen that had been hanging above the washstand. Upon closer inspection, she discovered that it had been tied with a piece of green thread that matched the color of Mrs. Describington's dress and the 13th towel. This observation led to a quiet discussion among the dormitory residents about whether these color coordinations were intentional or coincidental. In Dormitory 7, the children spent their unexpected free time conducting a systematic inventory of all the small changes they had noticed throughout the building. Cornelius Weekneys, who had a natural aptitude for organization, created a mental catalogue that included 17 sprigs of evergreen in various locations, 23 holly berries placed on windowsills and furniture surfaces, 8 pieces of colored ribbon tied to door handles and bed frames, 12 arrangements of pine cones and other natural objects, and one green towel that matched Mrs. Describington's dress. The mathematical precision of Cornelius's observations was typical of his approach to understanding his environment, but his focus on counting and categorizing was also a coping mechanism for dealing with the psychological discomfort of having unstructured time in an institutional setting where structure was the foundation of daily existence. In Dormitory 12, the children used their free time to engage in an activity that was strictly forbidden under normal circumstances. They told each other stories, not the improving moral tales that were read to them during educational instruction, but stories about their lives before coming to the orphanage, their dreams about their futures, and their theories about who might have been responsible for the Christmas morning changes. These stories were significant because they represented the first time that many of these children had been encouraged, or even allowed, to think of themselves as individuals with personal histories and future possibilities, rather than as interchangeable institutional residents whose primary function was to follow rules and complete assigned tasks. Penelope Restlessleep told a story about remembering her mother's garden, which had contained flowers that changed color throughout the growing season. Harold Snores shared a dream he'd had about becoming a carpenter and building houses for families who had lost their homes. Victoria Drowsyface described her theory that the Christmas morning changes had been arranged by Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic, who had seemed different from the other clergy who visited the orphanage. But the most significant story was told by Wilhelmina Dozealot, who had been at the orphanage longer than any other child and who rarely spoke during normal daily activities. Wilhelmina told her dormitory mates that she remembered a time when she had been very small, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, when someone had sung to her at bedtime. She couldn't remember who had sung to her, or what songs they had sung, or where this had happened. But she remembered the feeling of being sung to, the sensation of being important enough to someone that they would take time to create something beautiful specifically for her comfort and pleasure. Wilhelmina's story about being sung to became the catalyst for a dormitory-wide discussion about the nature of care and kindness, concepts that were largely theoretical for children whose primary experience of adult attention involved correction, instruction, and the enforcement of institutional rules. This discussion was interrupted at approximately 10:30 a.m. by the sound of music coming from the direction of the chapel, music that was unlike anything the children had ever heard at St. Bartholomew's. The music was being played on an instrument that none of them could immediately identify. It wasn't the simple melodies that Mrs. Describington sang during hymn time, nor was it the droning chants that accompanied formal religious services. It was complex, melodic, and filled with harmonic progressions that suggested both technical skill and genuine musical feeling. The children throughout the orphanage found themselves drawn to their dormitory windows, trying to determine the source of this unexpected music. What they saw was Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic in the chapel courtyard, playing what appeared to be a wooden flute, while reading from a book of musical notation that he had propped against a stone wall. Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic's musical performance was remarkable not only for its unexpected appearance in an institutional setting where music was typically limited to utilitarian hymn singing, but also for its quality. The melodies he played were recognizable as Christmas songs, but they were arranged in ways that made them sound both familiar and entirely new. The children listened to this impromptu concert with an attention and appreciation that they had never before applied to musical performance. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard music that existed purely for the sake of beauty, rather than for religious instruction or institutional routine. But the music was also significant for what it revealed about Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic's approach to his clerical duties. Unlike the other clergy who had served the orphanage, he was clearly investing personal time and effort into creating something that would bring pleasure to the children, rather than simply fulfilling his minimum professional obligations. The musical performance continued for approximately 25 minutes and included arrangements of Angels We Have Heard on High, The First Noel, O Come Emmanuel, and several other seasonal melodies that the children recognized from previous Christmas services, but had never heard performed with such skill and evident enjoyment. When the music ended, the orphanage fell into a silence that was different from the usual institutional quiet. This was not the silence of suppressed conversation or enforced discipline, but the contemplative silence of people who had just experienced something beautiful and were trying to understand what that experience meant for their understanding of their world. The children remained at their dormitory windows for several minutes after the music ended, looking toward the chapel courtyard, where Father, surprisingly enthusiastic, was carefully packing away his flute and music book. Several of the older children later reported that they felt a strange combination of gratitude and sadness. Gratitude for having heard such beautiful music, and sadness because they suspected that such experiences would be rare in their institutional lives. This combination of gratitude and sadness would prove to be characteristic of the children's emotional response to all of Christmas Day's special kindnesses. Each gesture of care and attention reminded them of how different their daily lives could be if such gestures were routine rather than exceptional. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again, because we haven't yet discussed the most significant aspect of Christmas morning at St. Bartholomew's, the breakfast that followed the children's return from their morning ablutions. Christmas breakfast was prepared according to Mrs. Sturcelot's usual methods and timing, but the ingredients she had available were dramatically different from the standard institutional fare. The mistaken delivery from December 23rd had provided her with ingredients that allowed her to create a meal that was unlike anything she had ever served at the orphanage. The porridge that morning was made with the usual oats, but it had been prepared with milk instead of water. The milk had been purchased specifically for this purpose with funds from Mrs. Describington's emergency penny jar, which had grown to contain nearly 6 pence through careful saving, and it had been sweetened with brown sugar and enriched with butter. The texture of milk-based porridge was entirely different from the water-based version that the children were accustomed to eating. It was creamier, more satisfying, and had a richness that made it feel like a completely different food despite being made from familiar ingredients. In addition to the enhanced porridge, Mrs. Sturcelot had prepared bread that was made with the fine flour from the mistaken delivery. This bread was lighter, softer, and had a subtle sweetness that came from the higher quality of the flour and the addition of a small amount of the brown sugar. But the most remarkable aspect of Christmas breakfast was the presence of fruit. Each child received 1/4 of an orange, which for most of them represented their first experience with citrus fruit. The oranges had been carefully divided to ensure equal portions, and each quarter had been arranged on the children's plates in a way that suggested care in presentation rather than mere functional distribution. The children's reactions to the orange quarters were immediate and profound. The bright color was unlike anything in their usual institutional diet. The scent was entirely foreign to their experience, and the taste was so complex and intense that several children initially weren't sure whether they liked it or not. Agnes Wobblefoot later wrote that her first taste of orange was like sunshine had become something you could eat, while Albert Sniffles described it as sour and sweet and bright, all at the same time, like a flavor that was too big for my mouth. But the most significant aspect of the orange experience was not the fruit itself, but what it represented. Evidence that someone had thought about their pleasure and had taken steps to provide them with something that existed purely for their enjoyment, rather than for nutritional necessity or institutional economy. The psychological impact of receiving something that was clearly special, clearly expensive, and clearly intended as a gift was transformative for children who had never before experienced institutional generosity that served no administrative purpose. The breakfast proceeded in relative silence, as most institutional meals did, but it was a different kind of silence than usual. Instead of the resigned quiet of children mechanically consuming food that they neither enjoyed nor disliked, it was the contemplative silence of people who were paying attention to what they were eating and trying to understand the implications of being served food that someone had clearly put thought and effort into preparing. Mrs. Describington maintained her usual position of supervision during the meal, patrolling the dining hall with her customary vigilance, but several children noticed that her expression was different from usual. Instead of her typical look of watchful authority, she seemed to be observing their reactions to the special food with what might have been satisfaction or pleasure. After breakfast, the children returned to their dormitories as instructed, but their mood was different from their earlier uncertainty about how to use unstructured time. The combination of warm water, beautiful music, special food, and Mrs. Describington's unusual dress had created a cumulative effect that transformed their understanding of what was possible within the institutional framework of their lives. In Dormitory 4, The children spent their time examining the holly berry that had been placed on their windowsill, discussing theories about its significance and whether it would be appropriate to touch it or move it. In Dormitory 9, the residents engaged in a collaborative effort to remember every detail of the morning's experiences, as if they suspected that these memories would become precious to them and wanted to ensure that nothing was forgotten. In Dormitory 11, the children took turns describing their dreams from the previous night, comparing notes about the unusual peacefulness of their sleep and trying to determine whether there was any connection between their dreams and the morning's surprises. But throughout all 12 dormitories, the dominant activity was simply talking, something that was normally discouraged during institutional hours, but which seemed not only permitted, but somehow encouraged by the morning's departures from routine. These conversations were significant because they represented the first time that many of these children had been able to express their thoughts and feelings about their institutional experience without fear of correction or punishment. The Christmas morning atmosphere of kindness and attention seemed to have created a temporary suspension of the usual rules about when, where, and how children were allowed to communicate with each other. And then, at exactly 11:47 a.m., something happened that would be remembered and discussed by the survivors of St. Bartholomew's Home for Foundling Children for the rest of their lives. Mrs. Describington appeared in the doorway of Dormitory 1 and made an announcement that was so unprecedented that several children initially thought they had misheard her. "You are invited," she said, using a word that had never before been applied to any aspect of orphanage life, to join Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic in the chapel courtyard for a special Christmas celebration that will include music, readings, and refreshments. The word "invited" hung in the air like a revelation. Children who had spent their entire institutional lives receiving orders, instructions, and assignments were being offered a choice about their participation in an activity that sounded like it might actually be enjoyable. The word "refreshments" was equally revolutionary. Institutional meals were provided according to schedule and necessity, but refreshments suggested food that was offered for pleasure rather than mere sustenance. But most significant of all was the suggestion that they were being included in something called a celebration, a concept that was entirely foreign to children whose institutional experience had been limited to routine maintenance of basic needs and preparation for eventual useful employment. The children's response to this invitation was initially stunned silence, followed by tentative questions about what exactly was expected of them and whether their participation was truly optional or merely presented as a choice while actually being mandatory. Mrs. Describington, apparently anticipating this confusion, clarified that participation was genuinely voluntary, that those who preferred to remain in their dormitories would not be punished or disadvantaged, and that the celebration would continue regardless of how many children chose to attend. This clarification was itself remarkable because it represented the first time in their institutional experience that the children had been offered genuine agency in deciding how to spend their time. The result was a gradual migration of all 47 children toward the chapel courtyard, motivated not by institutional compulsion, but by curiosity, hope, and the unprecedented experience of being invited to participate in something that promised to be pleasant rather than merely necessary. And that, after nearly 2 hours of explanation and context, brings us to the moment when the children of St. Bartholomew's Home for Foundling Children gathered in the chapel courtyard on Christmas morning 1687 to discover what a celebration looked like when it was designed for their pleasure rather than their improvement. But before we can describe that celebration, we need to understand exactly who Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic was, because his background and motivations were crucial to understanding why Christmas Day, 1687, was different from all other days in the orphanage's history. Actually, let me tell you about the refreshments first, because the food that was served at this unprecedented celebration represents perhaps the most dramatic departure from institutional norms that occurred during the entire Christmas experience. Subscribe if you're still awake, or don't. It changes nothing, but if you've made it this far, you clearly need a hobby. Consider subscribing. At this point in our narrative, dear viewer, and I use the term dear ironically because anyone who has watched 110 minutes of detailed descriptions of 17th century orphanage routines clearly has a complicated relationship with their own time management. we should pause to consider the profound meaninglessness of what we're doing here. You are currently 1 hour and 50 minutes into a video about what it was like to wake up on Christmas morning in an orphanage 338 years ago. This is information that will never be useful to you in any practical sense. You will never need to know the thread count of institutional blankets, the mathematical calculations required to heat wash water in a 17th century kitchen, or the sleeping arrangements of 47 orphaned children whose names I invented specifically to fill time in this video. Yet here you are, still watching. Still listening to me describe in exhaustive detail the daily routines of fictional children in a fictional institution during a historical period that has no relevance to your contemporary life. This raises profound questions about human nature, attention spans, and the mysterious psychological mechanisms that keep people engaged with content that serves no identifiable purpose. Are you still here because you genuinely care about these orphans? Are you waiting for something interesting to happen? Are you using this video as background noise while doing something more productive? Or have you simply become trapped in a state of passive consumption that prevents you from making the rational decision to stop watching? If you can honestly answer these questions, you have achieved a level of self-awareness that is rare among video consumers. Most people who watch content like this never examine their motivations for doing so, which means they learn nothing about themselves from the experience. But perhaps that's the real purpose of this exercise. Perhaps the true value of spending 2 hours listening to detailed descriptions of institutional breakfast routines and ceramic chamber pot manufacturing is not to learn about 17th century orphanages, but to confront the question of why we choose to spend our finite time and attention on activities that have no clear benefit. The children at St. Bartholomew's, after all, had no choice about how they spent their time. Their days were structured by institutional necessity. Their activities were assigned by administrative authority, and their personal agency was limited to small decisions about how to respond to circumstances beyond their control. You, on the other hand, presumably have other options. You could be reading, exercising, socializing, learning useful skills, or engaging in any number of activities that might contribute to your personal development, professional advancement, or general well-being. Instead, you're here, listening to me describe the breakfast preparations of a fictional cook named Mrs. Sturcelot, in service of a narrative that will ultimately reveal that Christmas morning at a 17th century orphanage was slightly less miserable than other mornings, but still pretty miserable overall. This choice, and it is a choice regardless of how passive it feels, says something important about the human capacity for finding meaning in meaninglessness, structure in chaos, and purpose in purposelessness. The orphans in our story found significance in small gestures: warm water, a green towel, enhanced porridge, and the unprecedented experience of being invited rather than instructed. These were objectively minor improvements to their circumstances, but subjectively, they represented revolutionary changes in how they understood their place in the world. Perhaps your continued engagement with this video represents a similar phenomenon. Perhaps in a world where most content is designed to provoke strong emotional reactions, sell products, or advance political agendas, there's something refreshing about content that exists purely to waste time in a methodical, comprehensive way. Or perhaps you're just procrastinating, and this video provides the perfect combination of mental engagement and practical uselessness that allows you to feel productive while actually avoiding whatever you should be doing instead. Either way, we're approaching the end of our journey together. In approximately 5 minutes, I'll reveal the small Christmas detail that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Then I'll tell you about Sleepsy Noel's boring Christmas calendar, which you probably don't need, but which provides me with an opportunity to practice conversion-focused marketing techniques on an audience that has already demonstrated remarkable tolerance for unnecessary information. After that, we'll conclude with some appropriately meaningless observations about the nature of institutional Christmas celebrations and their relevance to contemporary questions about care, community, and the human need for recognition. But first, let me tell you about Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic's refreshments, because if we're going to spend 2 hours on this topic, we might as well understand exactly what constituted celebration food in a 17th century institutional setting. Actually, you know what? If you're one of the 7 people still watching, comment Emperor Blandicus below. I'm genuinely curious about who has made it this far and why you've chosen to spend your Tuesday evening, or whenever you're watching this, learning about fictional orphans and their chamber pots. Now, about those refreshments. The refreshments prepared by Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic for the chapel courtyard celebration consisted of items that he had purchased with his own funds from the village market, representing a personal investment in the children's happiness that was entirely unprecedented in the orphanage's history. The spread included small cakes made with real butter and sugar, dried fruits that had been imported from Mediterranean regions, nuts that had been carefully cracked and cleaned, and small portions of cheese that had been aged for exactly the right amount of time to be flavorful, without being overwhelming to palates accustomed to institutional blandness. But the most remarkable aspect of the refreshments was not the food itself, but the way it was presented. Instead of the utilitarian distribution methods used for regular meals, the special foods were arranged on wooden platters that had been decorated with evergreen sprigs and holly berries, creating presentations that were designed to be beautiful rather than merely functional. Each child received their portion of refreshments on a small wooden plate that Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic had carved himself during his preparation for this celebration. The plates were simple but individually crafted, meaning that each child received something that had been made specifically for them, rather than being interchangeable with institutional property. And here, at last, is the small Christmas detail that I promised at the beginning of this video. Each of those wooden plates had been carved with a different letter of the alphabet, and the children received plates corresponding to the first letter of their institutional names. Agnes Wobblefoot received the A plate, Bartholomew Dampnose received the B plate, and so forth through all 47 children, requiring Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic to carve 23 different letters. Some letters were used for multiple children during the weeks leading up to Christmas. This detail was significant not because of the letters themselves, but because it represented individual recognition of each child as a distinct person worthy of personalized attention. In an institutional setting where children were treated as interchangeable units, receiving something that had been made specifically for them was a profound acknowledgement of their individual existence and worth. The celebration continued with more music, this time including songs that the children were invited to sing, along with, rather than simply listen to. Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic had prepared simplified arrangements of familiar hymns that the children could participate in without extensive musical training. But the most remarkable moment of the celebration occurred when Father Surprisingly Enthusiastic announced that each child would be allowed to keep their carved wooden plate as a permanent personal possession. This announcement created a moment of stunned silence, followed by the first spontaneous expression of joy that had been heard at St. Bartholomew's in anyone's memory. 47 children, who had never owned anything that was truly theirs, suddenly found themselves in possession of objects that had been made specifically for them and which they were allowed to keep forever. The psychological impact of permanent ownership, of having something that belonged to them personally rather than to the institution, cannot be overstated for children whose entire experience had been defined by the temporary use of institutional property. And that, after 117 minutes of explanation, context, and detailed description, is what it was like to wake up on Christmas morning in a 17th century orphanage. It was the experience of discovering that their circumstances, while still difficult, were not immutable, and that there were people in the world who were willing to invest time, effort, and resources in their happiness for no reason other than the belief that they deserved kindness. Now, before we conclude, let me tell you about Sleepsy Knoll's boring Christmas calendar. Speaking of Christmas details that you probably don't need, but which might somehow improve your life in ways that are difficult to quantify, I want to tell you about an exclusive offer that's available to the remarkably persistent viewers who have made it this far through our journey into institutional Christmas morning tedium. Introducing the Sleepsy Knoll Boring Christmas Calendar, a limited-time offer that perfectly captures the essence of seasonal indifference that we've been exploring for the past 2 hours. This isn't just any calendar. This is 31 days of carefully curated expressions featuring our beloved character Sleepsy Knoll, each one more magnificently underwhelming than the last. Day 1 features Sleepsy Knoll's mild seasonal acknowledgement expression. Day 15 showcases his tepid holiday enthusiasm face. Day 25 presents his masterpiece, Christmas Occurs Today look. Each expression has been scientifically designed to capture the exact emotional state of someone who has acknowledged that Christmas is happening without feeling any particular way about it. It's the perfect visual representation of seasonal obligation met with professional competence but zero emotional investment. Why do you need this calendar? Well, you probably don't. But consider this. In a world full of aggressive Christmas cheer, forced holiday spirit and mandatory festive enthusiasm, there's something deeply refreshing about a calendar that acknowledges Christmas exists while maintaining complete emotional neutrality about the fact. Sleepsy Noel doesn't judge you for not feeling sufficiently jolly. He doesn't pressure you to be merry. He simply exists in a state of mild seasonal awareness that suggests he's noticed it's December, but hasn't formed strong opinions about what that means. This calendar is perfect for people who want to acknowledge Christmas without committing to enjoying it, anyone who appreciates the aesthetic of institutional holiday decorations, individuals who find aggressive Christmas enthusiasm emotionally exhausting, those who need a visual reminder that it's possible to experience December without feeling anything in particular about it. The Sleepsy Noel Boring Christmas Calendar is available for a limited time only, specifically until I get tired of fulfilling orders or until people stop buying it, whichever comes first. You can find the link in the comments below, assuming I remember to put it there, at just $12.99, plus shipping, handling, and the psychological cost of owning something you probably don't need. It's competitively priced with other seasonal calendars, but significantly more honest about what December actually feels like for most adults. But here's the thing, this calendar isn't just about mild seasonal indifference. It's about the radical act of accepting your authentic emotional response to culturally mandated celebrations. Sleepsy Noel gives you permission to feel exactly as much or as little Christmas spirit as you actually feel, without pretending to experience joy that isn't genuine. In a way, Sleepsy Noel embodies the same principle that made Christmas morning special for the orphans at St. Bartholomew's. The recognition that small, genuine gestures of care are more meaningful than elaborate displays of forced enthusiasm. Mrs. Describington didn't transform the orphanage into a Christmas wonderland. She simply provided warm water and wore a pale green dress. Father, surprisingly enthusiastic, didn't create a spectacular celebration. He carved individual plates and played his flute in a courtyard. Similarly, Sleepsy Noel doesn't promise to make your December magical. He simply acknowledges that December is happening and maintains a state of calm acceptance about that fact. So if you're still here after nearly 2 hours of detailed descriptions of institutional porridge preparation and chamber pot logistics, and if you find something appealing about the idea of celebrating Christmas with the same understated acknowledgement that we've applied to 17th century orphanage life, then the Sleepsy Noel Boring Christmas Calendar might be exactly what you didn't know you needed. The link is in the comments, or it will be, eventually, when I get around to putting it there. And so we reach the end of our exhaustive examination of what it was like to wake up on Christmas morning in a 17th century orphanage, having spent exactly 2 hours discovering that the experience was characterized by small kindnesses, subtle changes, and the profound impact of being recognized as individuals worthy of care, rather than merely institutional problems to be managed. The children at St. Bartholomew's Home for Foundling Children woke on December 25, 1687, to discover that their world could be different, not dramatically, not permanently, but meaningfully. Warm water, enhanced food, beautiful music, and personalized wooden plates transformed their understanding of what was possible within the constraints of their institutional existence. This transformation was temporary. By December 26th, the routines returned to normal. The warm water became cold again and the porridge returned to its usual institutional blandness. But the children retained the memory of being cared for in ways that served no administrative purpose, and that memory changed their understanding of their own worth and the possibility of kindness in an indifferent world. Which brings us to the question of why anyone would spend 2 hours learning about this fictional Christmas morning, and what relevance 17th century orphanage experiences might have to contemporary life. Perhaps the answer is that in our current world of algorithmic content, manufactured outrage and artificial engagement, there's something valuable about content that serves no immediate purpose beyond the simple documentation of human experience, even imaginary human experience. The orphans at St. Bartholomew's found meaning in small gestures of recognition and care. Perhaps viewers who have made it through this entire video have found something similar, a form of attention and consideration that doesn't demand anything from you except your time and willingness to consider the experiences of people whose lives were very different from your own. Or perhaps you've simply discovered that you have a remarkable tolerance for tedium, which is also valuable self-knowledge. Either way, thank you for joining me on this extended exploration of institutional Christmas morning. If you enjoyed learning about fictional orphans and their chamber pots, you might also enjoy my upcoming video, What It Was Like to Fall Asleep in a Medieval Monastery, a 3-hour deep dive into the sounds of institutional snoring. Until then, remember that Christmas occurs today, tomorrow, and whenever the calendar indicates it should, regardless of how you feel about it. The Sleepsy Noel calendar link is definitely in the comments now, probably. And that, dear viewer, is how nothing became something but then went back to being nothing, just as we promised at the beginning. Merry Christmas, or rather a statistically average December 25th, which may or may not be of relevance to your time zone or belief system. Regardless, we have proceeded.